Welcome back, my fellow Warcraft grognards. Not long ago, we have talked about the old RPGs, or rather, the first old Warcraft RPG, because if this is somehow your first video and you didn't watch the first part, go watch the first part right now. If you didn't watch the first part, or if you are returning here right now after watching the first part, World of Warcraft, or rather Warcraft as a whole universe, used to have RPGs, tabletop RPGs associated with it, produced not just as someone's fan work, but as an official supplement that the writers of the RPG actually consulted with Blizzard on the lore and on the mechanics to best represent the Warcraft universe in a TTRPG setting. And in the last video, we talked about how kind of odd the first RPG seemed when you compare it to the modern setting, when you compare it to the things that have evolved out of the setting since. And we talked about how essentially it was just a campaign setting for D&D 3rd edition, because it had many of the things associated with the 3rd edition of D&D, including classes that it was in many ways expecting you to straight up import and use the classes from D&D, which, as people playing World of Warcraft today would know, have not exactly a direct correlation with the classes from the Warcraft setting. But back then, when this was released, the first RPG was released during the Warcraft 3 era, before World of Warcraft was released, so it didn't really have a crystallized class system. Like, imagine if somebody was releasing a League of Legends RPG today. We don't really have a class system for LoL, for Runeterra. There are like classes that the characters are classified as in LoL, but those classes are not really the same kind of classes. They're more like roles, the combat roles, than the actual classes you would expect, like a paladin. You can have under the mage class, you can have people using like elemental magic. You can have people using the void, because it's less about what kind of powers you use, how you use, what kind of spells you have. It's more about the role you have in combat. And when Riot releases the League of Legends MMO, and if it has classes, then it would probably differ greatly from the classes somebody would give to a LoL RPG now. So back when was the first RPG was released during the Warcraft 3 era, they didn't have the World of Warcraft class system to go off of, so they simply used the D&D class system. And now when the second RPG, the officially titled as World of Warcraft RPG instead of just Warcraft RPG, when World of Warcraft RPG was released, they started shifting the things more towards the actual classes you see in Warcraft. Because you see, while it was just a D&D supplement, the old RPG and all the first RPG and all of its supplement books, the second one really tried to be its own thing. It really tried to change things. A little bit, and give us a class system that is closer to the actual World of Warcraft. But still, there were some artifacts of its old system. I think this might be partially because it almost expected you to convert characters from the first RPG into the second RPG, and it provided this dedicated conversion document. So if you were converting a scout character, they couldn't have removed the scout class. they had to keep those base classes so that people converting from the first system that was very affected by D&D, so that they could convert easily into the second RPG. Therefore, some of these odd classes that don't seem to really relate to the later Warcraft lore are still there. Like, we still have barbarians and we still have scouts, despite those classes really being covered under different concepts within World of Warcraft. I assume that is all because of the conversion. Maybe the writers of the RPG were just really fans of the third edition D&D Ranger, and so they decided they just had to keep it, even though World of Warcraft didn't have it. There are some of these artifacts, but it evolves in this so-called second edition. In the WoW RPG, it starts evolving towards closer towards what we would imagine as the actual Warcraft class system. Because you remember how in the first RPG, classes like Hunter and Paladin were prestige classes, these like special advanced classes you had to qualify for and multi-class into to get like special bonuses. Well, now you will see Hunter and Paladin as actually full classes, and now you no longer have fighters, you actually have warriors. And still, because it's still a D20 based system, which still has a lot similar, a lot based on the actual D&D, it still doesn't play the same as a Warcraft warrior. So you don't have rage, you don't have like abilities like the warrior in WoW does. It's still mostly the fighter from D&D, except now it's named warrior to thematically better fit into this universe. But it tries much better to be its own thing. And I was told that the second RPG, the WoW RPG, was less successful than the first one, partially because it tries to be its own thing and people didn't like switching. People didn't like having to change their what they were used to, and we see that a lot with the 5th edition D&D nowadays, when people are trying to cram every little setting into D&D, like settings that are really have nothing to do, then they really don't fit the magic system or the classes or other things. They really try to cram it into D&D, and I guess people were always like that and they didn't like switching to it. But I really liked the second RPG better. Because it felt more like Warcraft. Felt more like the actual setting that I was used to playing with. And it still tries to do some of its own things, some of its own different things. And the two things that one of the things that it tried to do differently than World of Warcraft was, like, remember how in the first RPG there was the healer class, the generically named healer class that could like do these paths. That couldn't do these paths. The paths appear here. So that generic healer class could then do a prestige class to become a druid of the wild or a shaman. And here they invented these paths. I don't know if you heard that outside of my window. I hope you didn't. They invented these paths, and these paths are a lot like what the subclasses do now in 5th edition D&D. But back then, the 3rd edition didn't really have that, as far as I remember. I'm not an expert on 3rd edition D&D, so don't quote me on that. But D&D didn't really have that, and this RPG really tried to do its own thing with these paths. Because instead of like having a mage or a warlock class or a priest or a shaman class, it gave the healer and the arcanist class these paths. that they could pick up. And you had to pick one path, but you could then multi-class into different paths, and you could mix a mage and a warlock, much like you could multi-class between two completely different classes, and you, because they weren't prestige classes, they didn't have those special requirements, so you could just do two paths at once. They would make your character weaker, like anything in especially in the 3rd edition D&D and the D20 systems of the time, and to the lesser degree nowadays in the 5th edition, they do make your character somewhat weaker because you are missing out on the higher level features of those classes or of those paths. But this RPG tried to kind of innovate. I don't know if this was like a Blizzard thing, that Blizzard told them that mage and a warlock should be like two parts of the same class, or if this was like their original idea. That I do not know. I don't think I ever read anything that stated which one this was. But now we had the actual Warcraft lore classes that were incorporated as into the core class system, instead of having to adapt prestige classes into it. But it still does some new things. And something I forgot about, completely forgot, that the first RPG had the Tinker class. This RPG also has the Tinker class, and I completely forgot it about in the first video, but it really shows how core to the setting the Tinker was always considered. It really shows you that probably when somebody from the RPG team came up to Blizzard and talked about setting up things for the RPGs, probably somebody at Blizzard told them, Tinker is a core concept to our setting. We want to have those technology users represented strongly in our setting. But then it didn't materialize in World of Warcraft, and somehow after nearly 21 years, like in like 2 months, we will have 21 years of World of Warcraft, and somehow in those 21 years we still have not seen Tinkers, despite how core they were seen to the setting back then. And I find that absolutely insane, that we still do not have Tinkers. Like, the Tinkers have become kind of a joke in the community and among Blizzard as well. People like joke about this expansion still does not introduce Tinkers. It was a core of the setting's identity. This crazy tech, the crazy goblins with their zeppelins, and the steam boats in Warcraft 2. This crazy schizo technology of the Warcraft setting was really a core element of its unique feel and its unique fantasy, and it's totally neglected today. And instead, when Blizzard sends out these surveys with class ideas they were toying about, they give us like astrologists. Like, yeah, sure, I'm gonna play the con man pretending to read the future from the distant stellar objects, because sure, that's a much better class idea than a tinker, who was considered a core concept of the setting fantasy back then. But I'm not here to complain about why we still don't have tinkers in World of Warcraft. Maybe that will be its own video eventually, but this is not why I'm here to play. I'm here to praise this old RPG for having those tinkers as the core representation. So you might ask, if these core Warcraft classes became actual core RPG classes, so what were the prestige classes? Because it was still heavily based on the 3rd edition D&D. So what were the prestige classes? And now you see, now you could actually have, among the prestige classes, you could have the things that actually felt more like the idea of a prestige class, or like a hero class by modern Warcraft terminology. And like there are some really obscure concepts. There are some really like slam dunk obvious concepts, like there are demon hunters and death knights as prestige classes that you could multi-class into. And speaking about death knight, a funny story. I don't know how many of you were around back when Wrath of the Lich King was about to release. I was around during the TBC times, and I remember like discussions on forums. Remember forums? But before we had, everyone was on Reddit or on Discord servers, where one power tripping mod is closing a class Discord server because he is upset with balance changes. People were complaining on, not complaining, people were talking on the forums about, like, I vividly remember people talking about how like, which character are you going to sacrifice to become your Death Knight, because they read that the class Death Knight was going to be released, and they read that the requirement was to have a level 55 character first. They read that, and like, a lot of people just assumed that your character will have to die and turn into a Death Knight. You have to sacrifice your character to become a Death Knight. Of course, that was patently wrong, patently absurd, because it wasn't going to make you delete your old character and replace him with the Death Knight. But I guess in the RPG, in the WoW RPG, it could have worked like that, because it was a prestige class, meaning you would start as a, say, paladin or a warrior, and then you have to fulfill requirements. I don't remember the requirements right now, but I will probably put them on the screen while you're hearing this. To fulfill requirements to become the Death Knight over the gameplay. And you'd probably have to die and actually sacrifice the existing character to become the Death Knight. And you would also have to become a demon hunter and not just start as one like in World of Warcraft. You'd have to actually like start with like a Night Elf Scout, for example, and you probably have to, and this is probably great for role playing, because I didn't play it a lot of the system, didn't really get to experience a lot of these. I was mostly just reading this as a book, as a setting book that was expanding the lore that I was really enjoying. And imagine it as a role-playing opportunity when you actually become the Death Knight, the Demon Hunter, when you actually have to go through that initiation process. You actually role-play getting your eyes burned out. You actually role-play getting those tattoos. How do you pronounce tattoo? Tattoos. Having those tattoos burned into your chest. Imagine like role-playing through that, instead of just starting as already being a demon hunter on Mardoon. Like, imagine that. And it really had some of those, like Mountain King. It had a lot of those like very Shadow Hunter, those hero classes, or classes of heroes from the Warcraft 3 as those prestige classes, which is much closer to what I always imagined, Beastmaster, to what I always imagined as being what the prestige classes for World of Warcraft RPG should have really been. But also it introduced a lot of very unique new concepts that we haven't really seen in World of Warcraft since. And I still miss some of those concepts, and I wish we could see them in some way. Like one of these that I rediscovered recently, one of these very unique concepts was a holy strider. Probably none of you probably heard about this, But there was in the WoW RPG, there was a prestige class called Holy Strider, and it was meant to be specifically about a class of Tauren, like scouts and envoys, who would travel the world, and like they don't really have any magic except for this special ability they get. Then when they are fast traveling, they have this ability called Creasing the World, which allows them to like flatten the ground they are traveling through, because Tauren were not like really mounting back then. They didn't really have those kodos back then. And when the Holy Strider, which, as people have commented when I talked about it, that the Holy Strider wasn't really all that holy. It was holy in the more sense, the real world sense of ceremonial. Like they were sacred to the Tauren, even if they didn't have any holy powers, you know. So the Holy Strider just had this ability to reshape the world under his hooves as he was running. And that is a crazy ability for a character that is normally not really magical, unless you like could pick it up on a mage or something. But on a character that wasn't really magical, you could suddenly just cross the world, just like shape the world under your hooves as you go. And I found this a very crazy, unique concept that we haven't really seen in the game since. I don't know if that was the idea of the RPG writers, or if this is something that came from Blizzard. But there are a lot of those very unique classes. Like if you watched my videos about the classes in my system, in my original system, there are some classes that I imported from these old RPG classes, like Felsworn or Primal, which are these like very like feral type fighting characters. Like either a Felsworn or a Primal fights in melee, infusing themselves with their respective powers, be it Felsworn being infusing himself with themselves with fel powers, with chaos powers, and the Primal infusing themselves with nature powers and getting like beast parts on their hands, like beast claws and beast teeth growing, attacking with those. And of course, because Tinker was a base class, they also had a lot of technology-based prestige classes. I haven't really touched on a lot of them, but you know, the Steam Warrior that I did use as a class in my RPG was there. But there was also things like, was the Bombardier in this one? Because the first RPG also had, because first RPG also had the Tinker. It also had a lot of technology-based classes, but it was like it's prestige classes. Like you could be a bombardier who basically had this ability to like Junkrat style, like curveball bombs, and like without properly seeing an enemy, like throw the bomb around obstacles to always land the bombs in places he can't see. Like saying Junkrat style, comparing them to the Overwatch character. The RPG had a lot of variant classes. That variant classes, racial iconic classes, and of course something that I really liked, there was a creature classes. You could play an abomination by taking the first few levels as the abomination, and over the first few levels you would get the starting abilities of a typical abomination, or a centaur, or a flame waker, those salamanders from Molten Core, from Firelands. You could play as one of those guys, and you would just get the first few levels as one of them, as a racial class kind of, instead of advancing as a proper class. Like if you wanted to play like a Flame Waker Hunter, like you wanted to play that guy from the Firelands raid, Shanox, you wanted to play Shanox, you could play a Flame Waker Hunter, but you would have to pick the first few levels as a Flame Waker. And it's really crazy how many different options that you would have never seen since the World of Warcraft RPG gave you. The World of Warcraft RPG also had had like much like the first RPG. It also had a couple of unique books that added a build up onto the setting. It didn't have its own shadows and light or anything quite that crazy, but it had its own like monster guide, and it had an alliance player's guide and a horde player's guide, because really back then it was, and to some degree to this day, it was strongly considered that the alliance and horde, that this division between them was considered a core part of the setting's identity. So often between in characters, when you will pick like a character class, you would have this little label that called for alignment, but it wasn't like alignment like lawful good. It was asking for your loyalty to the alliance or horde or neutral or neither, and it would say that like witch doctors, which were a path of the healer class, that witch doctors are more common in the horde. So because it's a TTRPG, it doesn't really block you from like playing something unusual, because nobody can stop you really in to go to your home game and playing a human witch doctor. Nobody can stop you from that. But they would say things like it's more common for witch doctors to be in the horde. And before I go into Dark Faction, I do want Dark Factions. There was the last book that was released for the RPGs, and it took a long time to release, I remember. But I do want to talk about the two classes that were very unique to the World of Warcraft RPG, that were very strongly focused on the ideas Blizzard had of the setting at the time, that are not really reflected to this day. Like I'm talking about the Rune Master and the Inscriber. The Rune Master was essentially meant to be the Warcraft setting's monk before they gave us the actual monks. Like here we had the Brewmasters, but the Brewmaster in the Warcraft 3 era and before the monk was introduced in Mists of Pandaria, Brewmasters weren't really fighting a whole lot like a monk. Like sure they had fists and there was sometimes punch things, but they were mostly like more shaman focused, really, Brewmasters, and they were a prestige class in this second RPG. So the Brewmasters and the Rune Masters were two different things, and the Rune Masters were supposed to be the Warcraft's monk, because they weren't using psionics, which don't really exist in the Warcraft setting. They were using the rune magic. That was this also, much like technology, advanced technology, it had this very core element to the setting that we haven't really used that much. We have seen some kind of rune casters, and we have seen Death Knights using runes. So it is there in the background, but it's not really as common these days. And the Rune Masters would paint themselves with these runes that would enhance their combat ability, and then they wouldn't need to use a lot of armor. So the Rune Master would end up wading into melee combat and punching people much like a monk, because he enhanced himself with the runes instead of like psionic abilities, meditation, and like ki and stuff. And it was allegedly considered as a class for Wrath of the Lich King, but Death Knight won out for obvious reasons, because we are going to Northrend to fight the Lich King, so we probably should have Death Knights rather than Rune Masters. And ever since then, the Rune Master faded into obscurity. But what was the really strange class? What was the really strange class here? The Inscriber. I never played an Inscriber or played with an Inscriber. I tried to asking around about maybe someone played with an Inscriber and knows what it was like. But to the best of my ability, I tried to investigate, try to read into how the class is described, and it talks about the Inscriber having to always. It is a first off, it's a arcanist path. So it's like an alternative to a mage or a warlock who's using runes for everything, you know. So it's written like you have to prepare your runes on everything, and unlike the rune master who just paints himself and then uses it to enhance himself, the inscriber had a bunch of runes that he could draw on other people and enhance their abilities, which would end up with the inscriber between combat in the off time. The inscriber would paint the runes on their friends, and during combat they would like activate those runes to give them buffs. So it wasn't called as much, but it was almost like the Warcraft's bard, because they would also do some very silly things to enhance their friends, and it was like almost purely for like buffs, because the inscriber can't really cast spells unless he is also multiclassing into like mage. He can't really cast spells without using the runes, and you can't just run up to a guy and just paint a rune on his face and then slap him in the face to activate that rune, because that would, that would probably stop you. And the book even mentions that explicitly, that painting the runes on an unwilling creature would be very hard. So it ended up as mostly a highly like just a support class in many ways. It does give you the option that you can like take this like small stone or wooden tablet and paint the rune on that, and then you can run up to a guy, slap him in the face with this tiny wooden tablet, and then use your arcane magic to activate that rune and use an offensive spell like that. So it at least to me reading that, it sounds very silly, like a very silly class that in their off time they have to either paint their room in runes and only be able to fight enemies in that room where they prepared like explosive runes in the area, or they have to run up to a guy and slap them in the face with a tiny wooden rune and then activate it. So it is definitely much sillier than a bard, because if I compare it to a bard who stands in the back, and sure, it looks and sounds silly that when you think about it, then he's just, people are fighting and he's just sitting in the back and dun 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 playing. It sounds silly, but it makes, when you think about it, it makes sense that he's using like words and waves of air. He's using them to activate magic, and it makes sense how the inscriber does it. But a guy who just has to run up to people and slap them in the face with a tiny wooden stick, it sounds a lot more silly to me. Anyway, I think it's a very unique, very different idea that I could use a little bit of a reimagining if we were ever to see it again. Like maybe you just have a magical stylus that makes sure that the rune you draw in the air is on a flat surface. It projects a flat surface on which you draw, and then you use that magical stylus, like push in that rune and then activate it to blast out magic, like to make it a little less silly when you can draw the runes in the air. And that could probably, slight reimagining could probably help to make it a little more serious. But I talked about how the game had these very clear divisions, not very clear divisions, but it had these divisions between Alliance and Horde that were very common in the setting, and like still considered by many people to be a core to the setting's identity. But it also had its last supplement, which took a long time to release, which was called Dark Factions, which allowed you to play as a lot more different things. Like, this was the book that introduced the Death Knight prestige class, and a Naga anomaly prestige class, meaning Meaning, like, remember that one boss from the Burning Crusade, from, I think it was the Black Temple originally, that then got reused as a bunch of different mobs? The Naga boss that had this shell instead of his face, and another conch shell on his hand. And then in Najatar and BFA, in the fake Najatar and BFA, we got a bunch of these Naga with the tentacle tails. Those would be the Naga anomalies, where if you were a Naga, you could take the special prestige class to like grow different mutations. And this book had a lot of very unique like concepts. It had a lot for the Scarlet Crusade. It had the Brewmaster in this book, or the Dragon Sworn. When Dragonflight was about to be revealed, a lot of people were speculating that the Dragon Sworn class was going to be released, and instead we got the Evokers, which I'm not going to say which is better. I haven't really played with Dragonsworn a lot, and I don't really mind Evokers as a thing. I mind the Dracthyr more than I mind Evokers, but that is a long topic. And it also introduced a lot more creature classes, where like it gave you a creature class. Dark Factions gave you a creature class for a dragon. Like you could legit play a dragon, not a skinny little lizard guy cosplaying a dragon. You could actually like play a dragon. Like I don't remember how high was the level adjustment, how many levels you would have to spend in the dragon class before you could continue with another class. It was like whole 20 levels as a dragon. I don't remember that, but it allowed you, the RPG allowed you a lot of things. Hell, Dark Factions also introduced a lot of new races like Dragonspawn, Pandaren, and Tuskar. It introduced the Tuskar as a playable race. And I know Tuskar have a lot of fans these days, and they're still not playable. Like really, Blizzard should at this point just drop a lot of allied races that are just start in an existing town somewhere in the world, and like do not have a lot of lore attached to how or why they joined, and they're just there. Like, I don't think a lot of people would really mind that. Like Tuskar do not need a lot of reasons to just begin to be adventurers. Like we've seen Tuskar all around the world by now, and that Tuskar could just pick up a spear and go, okay, I want to be a warrior now, and okay, Horde, sure, I'm going to go to Orgrimmar and help you fight. Like they really don't need much more reasons than that. Blizzard could really just drop a ton of these races that people really wanted, but no, instead they have to give us like the third variant of dwarf or the fifth variant of troll, and not the variant of troll that we wanted, but half elves, half trolls. Which, don't get me wrong, Haranil look awesome, and they have very interesting lore that I wish that the night elves were more like them. But that's not what we've been asking for. Like why don't you give us the forest trolls with proper noses? Why don't you give us those instead of the whatever new thing you just came up with? There are still a ton of the old things that we want to play and we can't. And in a tabletop RPG, you can play pretty much anything you want, and it gave you a lot of these options. And that is why the World of Warcraft, the role-playing game, was probably my favorite RPG at the time, because it best represented the setting that I loved at the time in the format that I could understand without being too much of a D&D. So yeah, that was my look at the Second World of Warcraft RPG. And if you're more interested in specific aspects, like a more in-depth look into the specific classes or into the specific prestige classes, or like adapt them into like the modern settings, into modern RPGs. Or maybe if you'd like me to look at the other Warcraft RPGs, like there is a fun adaptation for World of Warcraft for 5e. I looked into it a little bit. I never played it. And if you would like me to look into that and talk about that, or like look into that inscriber into more detail and talk about what a silly unique class it was, let me know in the comments below. But that was my look at the World of Warcraft, the role-playing game, which I still do miss, even if I am playing my own system now. So that will be all for now, and if you enjoyed this, please don't forget to like and subscribe and comment and do all the YouTube things, and I hope to see you next time.